On a freezing February morning in 1934, a mansion sat above the Missouri hills like a European castle misplaced in the American Midwest. From where I stood, knee-deep in the dormant, skeletal remains of the formal gardens, the house didn't look like a home. It looked like a gargantuan red brick warning. It was a French Renaissance revival fortress, a monument of strength that refused to play with the light of the pale winter sun. I was 60 yards from the master suite, my fingers numbed despite the heavy leather of my work gloves, moving my shears through the rose bushes. Pruning is a violent necessity. You must cut back the living wood so the bloom has somewhere to go. But that morning, the wood felt brittle, as if the sap itself had retreated deep into the Missouri clay, hiding from a frost that felt more spiritual than seasonal. The air was thin, the kind of Midwestern cold that turns your breath into ghosts the moment they leave your lips. I remember the silence most of all. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a house holding its breath. A silence thick enough to choke the life out of a man. Inside those thick walls, built to impress the world and protect the bloodline, a man was losing a battle he could not buy his way out of. I had known August Anheuser Busch Sr. for 20 years. I had watched him move through these grounds with the discipline of a soldier and the calculation of a monarch. He was a man who had carried a brewing empire through Prohibition, the one era that should have killed it. He had outmaneuvered the moralists and the politicians, turning beer vats into yeast and ice cream factories just to keep the heart of the company beating. But the human body is a far more stubborn adversary than the United States government. For months, the Baron had been trapped in a negotiation with his own flesh. Heart disease, gout, dropsy, the kind of pain that turns a king into a prisoner of his own linens. I looked up at the window of his bedroom on the 3rd floor. The mansion, with its 14 bathrooms and 24 rooms, was designed for hosting, for turning a private life into a grand stage. Now, it was just a gilded cage for a man whose body was turning against itself. I imagined him in there, surrounded by the Tiffany stained glass depicting hunting scenes, while his own legs swelled with fluid and his heart skipped beats like a failing engine. Wealth like that casts a shadow long enough to cover an entire county, but it doesn't provide much warmth when the frost finally gets into your marrow. Just after 8 in the morning, I saw the light change in the room. His chauffeur had entered, as he did every morning, and turned on the radio, hoping a bit of music might cut through the stagnant air of the sick room. I gripped the shears, ready to make a clean cut on a stubborn stem of briar. Snap. The sound didn't come from the garden. A single gunshot snapped through the room and out into the winter morning. It was not the sound of a celebration for the repeal of Prohibition, which had only just returned the crown to his head a few months prior. It was the sound of surrender. In that heartbeat, August Busch Sr. had ended his life with a pearl-handled revolver. I lowered my shears, my heart hammering against my ribs. The silence that followed was different. It was heavier, more permanent. It was the silence of a dynasty, realizing it was mortal. The world likes its rich families to be untouchable, to glide through history in polished shoes and perfect photographs, never breaking in ways ordinary people recognize. But that gunshot was the first clue to what Grant's Farm really is, a place where triumph and tragedy keep taking turns. Later, the whispers traveled through the staff like a draft under a door. They talked about the note he left behind on his nightstand, not a manifesto of corporate strategy, not a dramatic confession of a fallen titan, just a few words on a scrap of paper. Goodbye, precious mommy and adorable children. He had underlined precious and adorable, as if he were trying to root those feelings into the soil one last time before the wind took him. The coroner's jury met right there at the mansion, and the verdict was simple. Suicide due to long illness. No scandal, no mystery. Just the cold recognition that suffering can crush even the strongest businessmen. As the thousands of mourners began to arrive, senators, rivals, and friends, I stayed in the dirt. Standing there in the biting Missouri cold, I realized the truth. This estate was never just a mansion. It was an altar to ambition, a fortress built on a piece of land already soaked in American myth. The property carried a name that did not belong to the Busch family at all: Grant's Farm. It was named for Ulysses S. Grant, a man who became a hero and a president, but who first lived on this land not as an icon, but as a struggling farmer fighting stubborn soil and harder luck. There is a strange truth about this mansion on the hill. It sits at the intersection of two American stories that seem incompatible. One is a story of failure, bankruptcy, and a man selling firewood in street, Louis just to survive. The other is a story of immigrant success so massive it reshaped the country. When those stories collided here, they didn't cancel each other out. They stacked on top of each other like layers in a wall. To understand why death echoed through that house in 1934, you have to go back farther than the red brick. You have to go back to the roots. You have to look at Adolphus Busch, who arrived in 1857 with a mind trained to recognize opportunity and a hunger that made poverty feel temporary. He didn't just sell beer, he sold a revolution. He embraced pasteurization and refrigerated rail cars so his product could survive journeys across a vast, thirsty nation. By the time he rose to the presidency of the company, the machine was already moving fast. But men like Adolphus do not just want wealth, they want permanence. They want something that anchors their name to the land itself, something that outlives products and profits. That is why he bought this land in 1903 for his son, August Sr. He wanted a private kingdom, a statement of American aristocracy. August Sr. had grown up inside that empire. When he received the property, he didn't just want a retreat, he wanted a statement. He built this chateau to prove the Busch family belonged to the elite. He filled it with oak, walnut, and marble, and art that celebrated the American West. Even as he modeled his home after European royalty, August Sr. left instructions about his burial. He didn't want to lie in the grand family mausoleum with the rest of the giants. He wanted to be placed within sight of Grant's farm, close to the estate he had built. Even in death, he clung to the land as if it could hold him. I went back to my roses as the sun began to dip behind the hills. The master was gone, but the roots remained. The big house fell quiet, filled with echoes and the memory of that morning. But I knew, looking at the heavy red brick, that the story wasn't over. A new figure was already moving toward the center of the story. August Gussie Busch Jr. Gussie, who loved life loudly, who loved spectacle, animals, and fast cars, was about to inherit a palace marked by blood. The frost would eventually melt, and the roses would eventually bloom, but the shadows of Grant's farm were just beginning to stretch. The mansion would hear laughter again and host presidents and celebrities, but it had already learned the sound of a gunshot, and the soil, as always, was waiting for the next layer of history to fall. The soil here has a memory, and it is a bitter one. Long before the red brick of the mansion tore into the sky, long before the first draft of Budweiser was poured into a crystal goblet, this land belonged to a man who knew the crushing weight of a failed harvest. As a gardener, I don't see the estate through the eyes of the tourists who flock to see the Clydesdales. I see it through the shovel. And when you dig deep enough into the Missouri clay at Grant's farm, you don't find gold. You find the grit of a man who was beaten down by the very earth he tried to tame. That man was Ulysses S. Grant. Before he was the general who saved the Union, before he was the President of the United States, he was just a desperate soul trying to survive on these 80 acres. He called his home Hardscrabble. It is a name that tastes like dust in the mouth, a name that sounds like fingernails clawing at a dry well. To the Busches, the land was a canvas for their American royalty fantasies. To Grant, it was a graveyard of ambition. I spend my days tending to the big house gardens, but my mind often wanders to that 4-room log cabin that still sits on the property. A humble, jagged little thing built of hand-hewn logs. Grant built it himself in 1856. I think about him out here, in the same humidity that makes my shirt stick to my back, swinging an axe against the stubborn oaks. He wasn't a man of leisure. He was a man with a growing family and a shrinking bank account. He cleared the brush, he hauled the stone, and he planted crops that the Missouri weather seemed to take a personal delight in killing. The soil in these hills is temperamental. It's a heavy, cloddy clay that holds onto water when you want it to drain and turns to cracked iron when the sun gets high. I feel it in my joints every time the seasons shift. Grant felt it too, but for him, it wasn't just a nuisance. It was a sentence. He tried to grow wheat, potatoes, and corn. He worked alongside slaves provided by his father-in-law, a dynamic that must have rotted his conscience even as he struggled to feed his children. I imagine him standing where the stables are now, looking out over a horizon that offered no promises. The American dream didn't look like a castle back then. It looked like a pile of firewood. That was Grant's reality. When the crops failed and the debt mounted, he was reduced to hauling cordwood into Street Louis, selling it on street corners to people who looked at his muddy boots and saw a nobody. He was a West Point graduate, a veteran of the Mexican War. And yet here he was, defeated by 80 acres of Missouri dirt. The irony is a thick vine that chokes the heart. Grant failed here so spectacularly that he eventually had to pawn his gold watch just to buy Christmas presents for his children. He abandoned hardscrabble in 1858, leaving behind the cabin and the ghosts of his effort. He walked away from this land, a bankrupt man, a failure by every metric of the Street Louis elite, and then came the Bushes. The transition from Grant's hardscrabble to the Bushes manor is the story of America in a nutshell. It is the story of how one man's rock bottom becomes another man's foundation. When Adolphus Busch bought the land in 1903, he didn't see a place of struggle. He saw a trophy. He was the quintessential immigrant success story, a man who had turned water, hops, and barley into a liquid empire. To him, purchasing the land of a former president was the ultimate arrival. It was the ultimate way to bridge the gap between his German roots and his American destiny. But as a gardener, I know that you cannot simply pave over failure. You can build a fence around it. You can call it a landmark. But the spirit of the struggle remains in the roots. Adolphus bought the land to give to his son, August Sr., the man who would eventually pull the trigger in that third-floor bedroom. There is a profound, almost cruel contrast in the way the Bushes treated the land compared to Grant. Where Grant struggled to pull a single meal from the earth, the Bushes poured money into it like water. They didn't need the soil to provide. They needed it to perform. They brought in exotic animals, bison, elk, and deer, turning a working farm into a private zoo, a spectacle of wealth. They didn't want the hardscrabble reality. They wanted a sanitized version of the wilderness. Yet, I often find myself walking near the old cabin in the early morning mist. It sits there, dwarfed by the grandeur of the mansion, a silent witness to the truth of this place. It reminds me that before the Bushes were royalty, they were immigrants looking for a foothold. And it reminds me that no matter how much marble you put in your hallways, you are still living on top of a history of loss. Wealth has a way of making people forget the texture of the ground. The Bushes walked these paths in fine leather, their eyes on the horizon of their business empire. They didn't feel the stubborn soil that Grant felt. They didn't feel the desperation of a man who realizes he cannot provide for his family. But I think, in the quiet moments, the land whispered to them. It whispered to August Sr. as his health failed, and Prohibition threatened to turn his brewery into a ghost town. It whispered that the empire was just as fragile as Grant's wheat crop. I remember once, while I was digging a trench for a new drainage pipe near the perimeter of the original Grant property, I hit something hard. I expected a rock, but when I cleared the mud, I found a rusted piece of an old plow, a jagged, iron tooth that had been buried for decades. I held it in my hand and felt a sudden, sharp connection to the man who had held it before me. It wasn't a Bush artifact. It was a Grant artifact. It was a tool of failure. I kept that piece of iron. I keep it in the potting shed. It serves as a reminder that this land has a dual nature. It is a place of incredible, soaring success, yes. It is a place where a German immigrant family became the kings of beer. But it is also a place where a president of the United States was brought to his knees. The American dream on this land is a layered thing. It started small and desperate. It started with a man in a log cabin, sweating and swearing at the clay. And even though the Bushes built a palace over it, the foundation is still made of hardscrabble. The tragedy of August Sr.'s suicide in 1934, the gunshot that shattered the morning, wasn't just a personal ending. It was the land reclaiming its toll. It was a reminder that even the most successful among us eventually have to settle our accounts with the dirt. As I move through the gardens today, I don't just see the manicured hedges. I see the struggle. I see Grant's calloused hands and August's gout-ridden feet. I see the blood on the grass and the sweat in the furrows. The Busch family thought they were buying a sanctuary, a place to escape the world, but they were actually buying a mirror. They were buying a piece of earth that refuses to let anyone forget that wealth is a season, but the soil is forever. I prune the roses today not because I think I can make them perfect, but because I know that if I stop, the wilderness, Grant's wilderness, will take it all back in a heartbeat. The thorns are always waiting. The shadows are always rooted deep, and hardscrabble is always just one bad season away. In my line of work, we talk a lot about grafting. It's a delicate, almost surgical process where you take a shoot from one plant and bind it to the sturdy trunk of another. Done correctly, the two become inseparable, the strength of the old root feeding the ambition of the new branch. I look at the history of this family, and I don't see a natural forest. I see the handiwork of a master grafter, and that master was Adolphus Busch. To understand the shadow that August Sr. tried to escape with a bullet in 1934, you have to understand the light cast by the man who planted the seed. Adolphus didn't just arrive in St. Louis in 1857. He erupted into it. He was the penultimate son of 22 children from a German valley. A boy born into a crowd where you either learn to shout or you learn to starve. He chose to shout. When he stepped off that boat, he didn't have a kingdom. He had what I call the immigrant's hunger, a hollow space in the gut that no amount of bread can ever quite fill. It's a hunger for more than food. It's a hunger for permanence. As a gardener, I see it in the invasive vines that wrap themselves around the oaks on the perimeter of the estate. They aren't trying to kill the tree. They are just desperate for a structure that won't fall when the wind blows. Adolphus didn't start by brewing beer. He started by selling the things that made beer possible. He waded into the unromantic, muddy backbone of the industry, the brewing supply business. He sold the vats, the hops, the malt. He was the man who provided the tools for other men's dreams. It was a strategic, cold-eyed way to learn the landscape. While others were worried about the flavor of a single batch, Adolphus was mapping the entire forest. He was looking at the roots, while everyone else was staring at the leaves. Then came the graft. Every gardener knows that if you want a fragile sapling to survive a harsh climate, you bind it to a native species that has already survived the winters. In 1861, Adolphus married Lily Anheuser. It was a double wedding. His brother married her sister. But for Adolphus, it was more than a union of hearts. It was a union of soil. Eberhard Anheuser, Lily's father, was a soap manufacturer who had inherited a failing brewery. He had the land, he had the equipment, and he had the Anheuser name, which already carried the weight of established local respect. Adolphus brought the hunger. He didn't just join the company. He consumed it from the inside out. He pushed the brewery to do what no one else thought possible. He wasn't content with being the best brewer in St. Louis. He wanted to be the only brewer in America. This is where the poet in me sees the tragedy beginning to bud. To achieve that kind of growth, you have to be willing to prune away everything else. You have to be obsessed with the big house before you even lay the first brick. He was a man of the future who was obsessed with the past. He embraced the cold science of pasteurization and the steel of refrigerated rail cars, innovations that allowed his beer to travel across the scorching plains without turning to vinegar. He was an industrialist through and through, and yet, look at what he built here at Grant's farm. He didn't build a modern factory to live in. He built a French Renaissance palace. He built a world of horse-drawn carriages and European finery. Why? Because a man who comes from nothing is always terrified that he still has nothing. I see it in the way he planted the trees on this estate. He didn't plant fast-growing maples that would provide shade in 5 years but rot in 50. He planted oaks. He wanted things that would stand for centuries. He wanted to look out his window and see a landscape that whispered, "You are never going back to that German village. You are a king now." But there is a danger in grafting. If the graft grows too fast, it can overwhelm the host. Adolphus grew so large, his ambition became so heavy, that the family name became a burden for those who followed. He didn't just build a business, he built a religion of more. More land, more animals, more bottles, more power. He was the one who bought this land, this hardscrabble ground, and tried to wash away the memory of Grant's failure with an ocean of money. He saw Grant's failure not as a warning, but as a foil. He wanted the contrast. He wanted the world to see that where a president of the United States had withered, a German immigrant had flourished. As I walk the grounds, I can almost feel his ghost. Not a haunting presence, but a demanding one. He's in the symmetry of the hedges. He's in the iron gates that scream, "Stay out and look at me," all at once. He was a man who understood the psychology of the crowd. He knew that people don't just want to drink beer. They want to drink an idea. They want to drink the king of beers. He created the spectacle that Gussie would later turn into a circus. He established the tradition of the Clydesdales, those massive, powerful beasts that look like they could pull the moon out of the sky. But even those horses are a metaphor. They are creatures of immense power, but they are bred for the harness. They are bred to pull a weight. Adolphus Busch lived his life in the sun, a soaring canopy of a man who provided shade for thousands of employees and his sprawling family. But as any gardener will tell you, the bigger the canopy, the deeper the roots must go to find water. And if the water at the bottom of the well is bitter, the whole tree eventually tastes it. He died in 1913, just before the world went mad with war and the country went dry with Prohibition. He was lucky. He died while the sun was still high, before the American royalty he created had to face the reality of a world that didn't want kings anymore. He left behind a palace, a fortune, and a son, August Sr., who had been raised in the shadow of a giant. August Sr. didn't have the immigrant's hunger. He had the heir's anxiety. He didn't have to graft himself onto anything. He was born into the woods. And when you are born into a tree that has already reached its height, the only direction left to go is down. I look at the portrait of Adolphus sometimes. The mustache, the sharp eyes, the air of a man who never asked for permission to exist. I think about the unromantic backbone of his early days. He knew the price of a bushel of hops. He knew the smell of a dirty vat. He knew the grit, but by the time he was done with this land, he had covered all that grit with marble and velvet. He thought he was building permanence. He thought he was anchoring his family to the Missouri soil so firmly that they could never be moved. But the soil knows better. The soil knows that everything that grows must eventually fall. And the taller the tree, the louder the crash. I move my spade through the earth today, thinking of his hunger. It's a quiet afternoon at the farm. The tourists are looking at the horses. The sun is hitting the red brick of the mansion, making it look like it's glowing. It looks permanent. It looks like it will be here forever, but I know the truth. I know that beneath the king of beers and beneath the French chateau, there is still that stubborn, hardscrabble clay, and no amount of gold can change the nature of the dirt. In the world of gardening, we distinguish between a greenhouse and a conservatory. A greenhouse is for growth. It's humid, messy, and functional. A conservatory is for display. It is a glass cage where nature is invited only after it has been scrubbed, potted, and taught how to behave. In 1910, as I watched the scaffolding rise against the Missouri sky, I realized that the Bushes weren't building a home for a family to live in. They were building a conservatory for a dynasty to be viewed. The big house didn't grow from the soil like the timber cabins of the pioneers. It was imposed upon it. I remember the day the first wagons of red brick arrived, thousands upon thousands of them, deep as dried blood. Most wealthy men of that era wanted the light, airy touch of Italian marble or the pale stone of English manners, not the Bushes. They chose red brick and limestone. It was a choice that spoke of Teutonic weight, of a French Renaissance style that felt less like a chateau and more like a fortress. As a young hand on the estate back then, I watched the masons work. There was no delicacy in the way that house went up. It was all muscle. It was built with the same industrial inevitability as the brewery downtown. While I was digging holes for the young elms, the house was digging its heels into the ridge. It was designed by Barnett, Haynes and Barnett, the same architects who built the Cathedral Basilica in Street Louis. That should tell you everything you need to know. The Bushes didn't want a living room. They wanted a nave. They didn't want a roof. They wanted a crown. By 1913, the structure was complete, and it sat above the hills like a predator in repose. Inside, the opulence was enough to make a man feel small. There were 28 rooms, and not one of them felt like a place where you could kick off your boots. The big house was a stage, and every member of the family was an actor in a play called Success. I remember being called inside once to move some heavy ferns near the grand staircase. The light didn't just enter that house. It was filtered through Tiffany's stained glass that cost more than a dozen Midwestern farms. The glass didn't show the Missouri landscape. It showed idealized hunting scenes, pastoral European vistas, and the family's own triumphs. It was a way of making sure that even the sun had to wear the Busch colors before it was allowed into the parlor. Then there was the gun room. For a gardener, a tool is for maintenance. A spade, a rake, a hoe. But in the Busch gun room, the tools were for conquest. Polished wood, etched steel, rows of rifles and revolvers that had traveled the world. It was a room that celebrated the harvest of the hunt. A room that smelled of oil and ego. It felt like the heart of the fortress. A place where the baron could sit and remind himself that he was the master of all he surveyed, from the bison on the lawn to the birds in the air. But the most striking thing about the mansion wasn't what was inside. It was what it did to the people who lived there. In a small house, you have to look at one another. In a fortress of red brick, you can go a whole day without hearing a family member's voice. The halls were so wide they felt like streets. The ceilings were so high they swallowed whispers. It was a place designed for hosting 300 people at a gala, but it was a lonely place for a child to eat breakfast. Anheuser Busch was the one who envisioned this stage, but he didn't get much time to perform on it. By the time the mortar was fully dry and the gardens were starting to take shape under my hands, the old man's health was fading. He was a giant who had outgrown his own garden. He had spent his life grafting and growing, and now, the weight of the canopy was too much for the roots. In October of 1913, the news came down to the potting shed. The king was dead. Adolphus died in Germany, but his heart was here, or at least his name was. When they brought him back, the funeral was a spectacle the likes of which Street Louis had never seen. Thousands of people, a floral tribute that required dozens of trucks, and a silence that stretched from the brewery to the farm. But as I watched the procession, I wasn't looking at the casket. I was looking at his son, August Sr. Transition in a garden is a delicate time. When a great oak falls, the sapling underneath is suddenly exposed to a sun it isn't ready for. The shade is gone, and the wind hits harder. August Sr. was a different breed of man. Where Adolphus was a force of nature, loud, charismatic, and instinctively bold, August was a man of systems and duty. He inherited the big house, but I think he also inherited the coldness of its brick. He walked the halls not as a conqueror, but as a steward. He was a man who felt the eyes of his father in every Tiffany window and heard his father's voice in every creak of the floorboards. I remember seeing him on the terrace shortly after the funeral. He was looking out over the valley, over the land that Grant had failed on and his father had conquered. He looked stiff in his fine suit, his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't look like a man enjoying his inheritance. He looked like a man checking the reinforcements of a siege. And the siege was coming. Adolphus had died at the perfect time, at the peak of the empire's glory. He didn't have to see the dark clouds of World War I, where his German heritage would be turned into a weapon against his family. He didn't have to see the dry, hollow eyes of Prohibition, when the government would try to turn the king of beers into a common criminal. August Sr. took the keys to the fortress just as the gates were being hammered. He moved into the master suite, the same room where, 2 decades later, he would decide that the pain of the body and the weight of the crown were too much to bear. As a gardener, I knew the transition would be hard. You can't just replace a great oak with another oak and expect the forest not to notice. The soil was different now. The American royalty phase was over. The survival phase was beginning. I went back to my work, planting the winter bulbs. The mansion sat behind me, a massive, silent witness in red brick. It was a beautiful building, perhaps the most beautiful in the state. But as the sun set, casting long, jagged shadows from the turrets across the lawn, it didn't look like a sanctuary. It looked like a tomb that hadn't been filled yet. The big house was standing. The walls were thick. The gun room was full. But the man inside was starting to realize that you can build a fortress against the world, but you can't build a fortress against time. And you certainly can't build one against the ghosts of the men who came before you. The era of August Sr. had begun, and with it, a long, slow winter that would test the very foundations of the red brick. In the garden, a legal drought is a natural catastrophe, a season where the sky turns to brass and the earth cracks open, begging for a drop of mercy. But in 1920, the drought that hit Grant's farm didn't come from the heavens. It came from Washington. They called it Prohibition, a word that sounded clinical but felt like a slow strangulation. For a family whose very blood was brewed from hops and barley, the Volstead Act wasn't just a law. It was an attempt to erase their existence. As a gardener, I watched the estate transform during those dry, hollow years. The vibrance of the big house seemed to dim, as if the red bricks themselves were losing their color. The air, which used to carry the faint, yeasty scent of the brewery drifting from downtown, became sterile. We weren't a kingdom anymore. We were a fortress under siege, trying to survive on the unromantic backbone of industry while the world outside turned its back on us. To keep the lights on in the mansion, the family had to pivot with a desperation that would have made Adolphus proud, though it lacked his flair. The great vats that once held the king of beers were now churned with milk for ice cream or filled with thick, cloying malt syrup. We sold ginger ale and root beer, pale, sugary imitations of the real thing. It was like trying to sustain an old-growth forest with a spray bottle. I remember the Prohibition gardens I had to maintain. We grew more vegetables, more practical crops. The focus shifted from the spectacle of the flower beds to the necessity of the root cellar. But the most difficult thing to cultivate during those years wasn't the food. It was the morale. August Sr. moved through the grounds like a man walking through a graveyard. He had inherited the throne just in time for the palace to be declared illegal. The atmosphere grew heavy with more than just the lack of beer. There was a poison in the air. Anti-German sentiment. The Great War had ended, but the suspicion remained. People looked at the red brick fortress on the hill and didn't see American success. They saw the Huns. They saw a family with German names and German traditions, and they whispered that the beer money was tainted. Every time I went into town for supplies, I felt the coldness of the stairs. I'd return to the farm and pull the gates shut behind me with a sense of relief. The garden became our hiding place, a sanctuary where the outside world's bitterness couldn't take root. But even the gates couldn't keep out the real darkness. In 1930, the fear that had been simmering for a decade boiled over. The kidnapping of August Gussie Busch Jr.'s son, little Adolphus Busch III, shattered whatever sense of security we had left. I remember the night the news broke. The big house went into a state of total lockdown. The gun room, once a place of trophy displays, became an armory. Guards patrolled the perimeter with a grimness that made my own work feel trivial. I saw Gussie during those days. The man who would later become the face of the family's rebirth was, at that moment, a broken father. He paced the terrace, looking out into the woods where the shadows seemed longer and more predatory than ever before. He wasn't looking at the deer or the bison. He was looking for a sign of his boy. The kidnappers were amateurs, thank God, and the child was returned safely after a ransom was paid, but the damage was done. The innocence of the farm was gone. The soil had tasted fear, and that's a flavor that doesn't wash away with the rain. During the height of the dry years, the mansion felt like a mausoleum for a living family. We were surviving, yes. We were selling yeast and refrigerated cabinets, making enough to keep the staff paid and the hedges trimmed. But there was no joy in the growth. It was survival by inches. I'd spend hours pruning the elms, thinking about how a tree can look perfectly healthy on the outside while the heartwood is rotting away from a lack of nutrients. August Sr. became more insular. The illness that would eventually take him, the gout and the heart disease, began to tighten its grip during this era. I think the stress of Prohibition did more damage to his arteries than the beer ever did. He felt the weight of every employee's family on his shoulders. He felt the betrayal of a country that his father had helped build. The gardens were my only solace. I'd lose myself in the rhythm of the seasons, reminding myself that winter, no matter how long or dry, eventually has to give way. I planted bulbs in the frozen earth of 1931, wondering if the family would even be here to see them bloom. We were a dynasty in hibernation, waiting for the political frost to break. There were moments of irony that only a gardener would notice. We had all this land, all this American royalty status, and yet we were reduced to selling near beer, a drink that looked like the real thing but had no soul. It was a metaphor for our lives at the farm. We kept up the appearances. The brass was polished, the horses were fed, and the red brick was scrubbed. But the spirit of the place was parched. I remember standing near the hardscrabble cabin one evening in 1932. The ghost of Grant's failure felt very close that night. I realized that the Bushes were experiencing their own version of hardscrabble. They had the mansion, but they were fighting the same stubborn soil of circumstance that had defeated the general. The only difference was the scale of the struggle. The end of Prohibition in 1933 should have been a moment of pure triumph. And in the papers, it was. They showed the first case of Budweiser being sent to the White House. They showed the crowds cheering in the streets of Street Louis. But at Grant's farm, the celebration was muted. The winter of the soul had lasted 13 years, and it had left scars that no amount of legal beer could heal. August Sr. was too tired to celebrate. The man who had held the fortress together was exhausted. He had won the war, but he had lost his health and his peace of mind. The sound of surrender that I heard in 1934 was the final echo of the Prohibition years. It was the realization that even when the drought ends, some things remain withered beyond repair. I look back on those years as the time when the garden truly became a fortress. We weren't just growing flowers. We were guarding a legacy that the world wanted to burn down. We survived on malt syrup and ice cream, but mostly we survived on a stubborn, Teutonic refusal to go away. As the first legal beer trucks rolled out of the brewery, I was back in the dirt, preparing the beds for a new era. The shadows of the kidnapping and the anti-German slurs were still there, tucked under the hedges, but the sun was finally starting to hit the red brick again. Gussie was stepping into the light, ready to turn the farm from a hiding place into a spectacle. But I knew the truth. I had felt the cold of the 1920s in my bones. I knew that even the strongest fortress has its cracks. And I knew that the next season of growth would be fueled by a hunger that the dry years had made permanent. In gardening, there is a phenomenon known as rebound growth. After a long, harsh winter or a period of severe pruning, certain plants don't just return, they explode. They push out shoots so fast the wood can barely harden. They bloom with a ferocity that seems almost desperate, as if they are trying to make up for every lost day of sunlight. August Gussie Busch Jr. was the human embodiment of rebound growth. If his father, August Sr., was the fortress, stiff, duty-bound, and shadowed, Gussie was the fireworks. After the gunshot in 1934, the big house had been a tomb of red brick, a place of hushed voices and drawn curtains. But when Gussie took the reins, he didn't just open the windows, he tore down the shutters. He was a man who lived loudly, a man who believed that if a little bit of something was good, then a spectacular amount was mandatory. I remember the change in the air the moment he decided to make the farm his stage. The gardener's life is usually one of quiet patterns, but with Gussie, the patterns became parades. He was a man of impulse, and his most famous impulse came in the form of a young Swiss woman named Gertrude Trudy Buchholzer. He had met her in Switzerland, a whirlwind romance that felt more like a plot from a Hollywood film than a corporate succession. He was a beer baron from the Midwest. She was a restaurateur's daughter from the Alps. When he brought her back to Grant's farm, it was as if a new species had been introduced to the ecosystem. Trudy was vibrant, sharp, and possessed a natural elegance that didn't need the heavy, Teutonic weight of the old bush traditions. I watched from the greenhouses as she revived the locked rooms. For years, certain wings of the mansion had smelled of mothballs and memory. Trudy threw open the doors. She understood that a mansion like this needs the friction of people to keep the damp out of the walls. Under her touch, the big house stopped being a museum of August Sr.'s pain and started being a royal court. The transformation was physical. We weren't just planting for the seasons anymore, we were planting for the spectacle. Gussie loved the idea of the public seeing his kingdom. He began to open the farm to the people, but he kept the big house as his private sanctum, a place where the harvest festivals became legendary. I remember the autumns of that era. We would spend weeks prepping the grounds. The harvest wasn't about survival anymore, as it had been during the hardscrabble days or the dry years. It was about theater. There were mountains of pumpkins, rivers of beer, and tables that groaned under the weight of German delicacies. Champagne flowed as if the Prohibition drought had never happened. From my position near the edge of the terrace, I would watch the guests. Governors, movie stars, and captains of industry would mingle on the lawns. Gussie would be in the center of it all, his voice booming, his laughter echoing off the red brick. He had a way of making everyone feel like they were part of a grand, golden age. He brought in the animals, not just the bison, but elephants, monkeys, and exotic birds. He turned the farm into a living zoo, a place where the American dream was dressed in sequins and served in a krug. But as a gardener, I am trained to look for what's hidden beneath the blossoms. I knew exactly where the master suite was. I knew which window belonged to the room where the gunshot had snapped through the morning air in 1934. The contrast was jarring, almost hallucinatory. On the lawn, there would be a brass band playing and children laughing at the trained chimpanzees. People would be toasting to King Gussie with the newest batch of Budweiser. But if you looked up at those third-floor windows, the red brick seemed to hold onto a different vibration. I often wondered if Gussie heard the echo. I wondered if, in the middle of a toast, he ever felt a sudden chill, a reminder that the very floorboards he stood on had once been soaked in his father's desperation. He lived so loudly, I suspect, because he was trying to drown out that silence. He filled the house with guests because a crowded room is harder to haunt. Trudy was his partner in this defiance. She was the one who curated the life of the estate, managing the hundreds of staff and the endless cycle of parties. She brought a sense of European joie de vivre that the farm had never seen. She was the light to the old man's shadow, but even light has a way of casting its own darkness. The pressure to maintain the perfect court, to be the ultimate hostess while Gussie's appetites for life, and for other things, began to show in the set of her shoulders when the guests weren't looking. There was one night, a particularly lavish midsummer gala, where the irony reached its peak. The gardens were lit with thousands of fairy lights, and the scent of night-blooming jasmine was so thick it was almost intoxicating. Gussie had ordered a display of fireworks that mirrored the colors of the Budweiser label. As the rockets screamed into the sky and burst into red and gold, the noise was deafening. I stood in the shadows of the topiary, watching the flashes of light illuminate the mansion. Every time a firework went off, for a split second, the big house looked like it was on fire, and for a split second, the pop of the explosion sounded exactly like the snap of a pearl-handled revolver. I realized then that Gussie wasn't just building a court, he was building a wall of noise. He was using the spectacle to stay one step ahead of the family legacy. He was the king of spectacle because he refused to be the prince of grief. The public loved it. They saw the generosity, the open gates, and the majestic Clydesdales. They saw a man who had won at life. They didn't see the stubborn soil that still sat beneath the manicured turf. They didn't know that the gardener was still pulling weeds that had their roots in 1934. Wealth, when it reaches the level the Bushes had attained under Gussie, becomes a kind of gravity. It pulls everything toward it, the beautiful, the exotic, and the broken. Gussie's era was the most vibrant the farm would ever see, but it was also the most fragile. You cannot keep the rebound growth going forever. Eventually, the wood has to harden, or the branch will snap under its own weight. As I finished my rounds that night, long after the guests had gone and the last embers of the fireworks had faded, I walked past the big house. It was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence than the one in his father's day. It was the silence of an audience waiting for the next act. Gussie had turned Grant's farm into a legend. He had made the Bush name synonymous with the American party. But as I looked up at the darkened windows, I knew that the king was still just a tenant on this land. The soil, the Grant soil, the Adolphus soil, was still there, waiting. The era of spectacle was in full bloom. But in the garden, we know that the most beautiful flowers are often the ones that precede a long, slow decay. The shadows were still there, tucked away in the gunroom and the master suite, waiting for the music to stop. In the world of professional gardening, there is a distinct boundary known as the ha-ha, a recessed landscape design that creates a vertical barrier while preserving an uninterrupted view of the horizon. It is an illusion of openness that hides a hard boundary. In 1954, when Gussie Busch decided to open the gates of Grant's farm to the public for free, he essentially turned the entire 80-acre estate into a grand, living ha-ha. He invited the world to see the horizon of his success, but he made sure the walls between the spectacle and the bloodline were higher than ever. As a man who spent his life tending to the private silences of the Bush family, the transition to a public landmark was a shock to the system of the land itself. The quiet, mossy corners where August Sr. once brooded were suddenly trampled by the boots of thousands of street, Louis families. The Bavarian-style courtyard, with its intricate timbering and weathered stone, became the stage for a performance of generosity that only a beer baron could orchestrate. Gussie didn't just want people to visit, he wanted them to be overwhelmed. He understood that wealth, if hidden behind high walls, breeds resentment, but wealth shared as a circus breeds loyalty. And so, the spectacle began in earnest. I remember the day the first public visitors arrived. They walked through the gates with a look of reverence and disbelief. They were handed free beer in the courtyard, a masterstroke of marketing that made every visitor a brand ambassador. But for me, the most surreal sight wasn't the crowds, it was the animals. Gussie had a hunger for the exotic that bordered on the obsessive. Suddenly, my work shifted from maintaining local Missouri flora to trying to keep the grass alive under the hooves of creatures that belonged on the other side of the planet. We had camels grazing near the hardscrabble cabin. We had kangaroos leaping through the meadows where Ulysses S. Grant had once struggled to grow wheat. There were elephants and buffalo, and exotic birds that screamed in the Missouri humidity. To the public, it was a fantasy. They saw the camels and the kangaroos as symbols of a family so powerful they could bend geography to their will. They saw the king of beers holding court in a place where the American Midwest had been grafted onto a German fairy tale. They were tasting the fantasy, and the taste was cold, crisp, and free. But as a gardener, I saw the friction. I saw how the kangaroos didn't quite know what to do with the heavy Missouri clay. I saw the camels looking toward the horizon with a vacant, displaced longing. And I saw the family. While the crowds were marveling at the Clydesdales, those magnificent, feathered hoof giants that moved with the synchronized grace of a military parade, the Bushes were retreating. The big house became a literal fortress of privacy. From the gardens, I would see the family members watching the crowds from the high windows, like royalty observing the peasants from the safety of the ramparts. Gussie would occasionally descend to mingle, playing the part of the man of the people with practiced ease. He would slap backs, kiss babies, and hand out nickels. But when the gates closed at sunset, the mask didn't just slip. It was locked in a safe. The royal court was a high-pressure environment where the expectations of being a Bush were starting to fray the nerves of the younger generation. I remember one afternoon, I was working on a hedge near the private entrance to the mansion. A young mother from the city, clutching a plastic cup of beer, wandered a bit too far from the designated path. She looked at the red brick of the mansion, her eyes wide with a mix of envy and awe. "It must be perfect," she whispered to herself, "to live in there, with all of this." I didn't say a word. I just kept clipping. I wanted to tell her that the perfection she saw was a thin layer of topsoil over a very deep, very old hole. I wanted to tell her that the animals were just as trapped as the people. The camels were in Missouri, and the children in that house were in a world where consequences were something that happened to other people, and tragedy was a ghost that lived in the master suite. The opening of the farm was the peak of Gussie's power. It solidified the Busch family as the royalty of Street, Louis. But it also marked the moment the family stopped being people and started being symbols. When you turn your home into a public monument, you lose the right to be messy, to be human, or to be broken in peace. The Clydesdales were the perfect metaphor for this era. They are massive, powerful, and beautiful to look at. But they are also animals of burden. They are bred to pull a wagon that is always full, always heavy, and always expects them to move in a straight line for the cameras. As the 1950s bled into the 60s, the spectacle only grew. The harvest festivals became more lavish, the guest lists more famous. But the soil was getting tired. The constant traffic of thousands of feet was compacting the earth, making it harder for the roots to breathe. I spent more and more of my time trying to repair the damage that the public left behind. The litter, the trampled flowers, the wear and tear of being a legend. I'd stand in the courtyard after the crowds left, the smell of beer and animal manure lingering in the evening air. The Bavarian charm felt a little more like a stage set than a home. I'd look up at the big house, and I could almost feel the weight of the secrets being kept behind those red bricks. Gussie had given the world a gift, yes. He had opened the gates and let the light in. But in doing so, he had forced the shadows deeper into the corners of the mansion. The privilege of the Busch name was becoming a cage. The children were growing up in a world where they were greeted with cheers by strangers but were haunted by the expectations of a father who demanded nothing less than perfection. The thorns of privilege were starting to grow. I saw it in the way the younger heirs drove their cars a little too fast down the winding paths. I saw it in the sudden, sharp arguments that would break out on the terrace when they thought the gardener was out of earshot. The fantasy was for the public, the reality was for the Busches, and the reality was starting to taste like the bitter dregs of a long-ago party. I pruned the roses that year with a sense of foreboding. The golden age was in full bloom, but I knew what happens to a plant that is forced to bloom too hard for too long. It exhausts itself. It becomes vulnerable to the pests and the blights that are always waiting in the shadows. Grant's farm was no longer a farm. It was a brand. It was a postcard. And as every gardener knows, a postcard doesn't have roots. It just has an image. The struggle of Grant and the hunger of Adolphus had been paved over with Bavarian stone and exotic wonder. But the soil, the stubborn, red Missouri soil, was still there. And it was getting ready to remind the royalty that even a king has to pay his dues to the earth. The gates were open, but the hearts were closing. And the next decade would bring a darkness that no amount of free beer or fireworks could hide. In a garden, there is a point where the abundance of summer tips over into the decay of autumn. It is a subtle shift at first, a yellowing at the edge of a leaf, a piece of fruit that looks perfect on the branch but is hollow and black at the core. We call it the rot. It doesn't come from the outside. It starts from within, fueled by too much rain, too much sugar, or perhaps just the exhaustion of the plant itself. By the 1970s, the spectacle of Grant's farm had begun to ferment into something dark. The thorns of privilege I had seen earlier had grown into strangling vines, and the soil was becoming toxic. As the gardener, I watched the family's vibrancy curdle. Gussie was older now, still the king. But even a king cannot hold back the tide of grief when the universe decides to settle a debt. In 1974, the first true blow to the heart of the modern dynasty fell. It wasn't a corporate takeover or a political scandal. It was the death of 8-year-old Christina Busch. She was Gussie's granddaughter, a bright spark in the heavy atmosphere of the estate. She died in a car accident, a violent, senseless intrusion of reality into the protected fantasy of the farm. I remember the day the news reached the gardens. The silence that fell over the red brick wasn't the respectful quiet of the 1930s. It was a jagged, piercing silence that felt like a fracture. I saw Gussie in the days following. It was the first time I realized that even the largest tree can be split by a single bolt of lightning. He didn't just look sad, he looked broken. The man who had lived loudly suddenly seemed to shrink. He had spent decades building a world where he was in control, where he could command elephants and presidents, but he could not command the road or the heartbeat of a child. The king of spectacle was suddenly a grandfather standing in the dirt, realizing that all his gold couldn't buy a single minute of the past. From that moment on, the weeds began to take over. When a gardener loses heart, the garden suffers. And when the patriarch of a dynasty loses his grip on the narrative, the heirs begin to drift into the tall grass. The rot moved from the spirit to the blood. In 1976, the big house witnessed a horror that even the old-timers like me couldn't have imagined. It happened in the heart of the fortress, in the rooms where the Tiffany glass usually cast beautiful, colored shadows. Peter Bush, Gussie's son, shot and killed his 18-year-old friend, David Lear. I was in the potting shed when the sirens cut through the Missouri night. The sound was a desecration of the farm's peace. The story that came out later was messy, a mishandling of a firearm, a moment of tragic negligence inside the walls of power. To the public, it was a shocking headline. To me, it was the inevitable result of a garden that had been allowed to grow wild without the discipline of consequence. When you raise children in a royal court where every whim is a command and every wall is a shield, they lose the ability to see the edge of the world. They think the laws of gravity and the laws of men are suggestions. Peter was 20 years old. David Lear was dead, and the big house was once again a crime scene. But here is where the metaphor of the garden gets complicated. In nature, a fallen branch stays where it lies. In the world of the bushes, the fallen are picked up, dusted off, and hidden behind the hedge. The legal outcome of the shooting felt softened by power. There was a plea, a term of probation, a quiet settlement. The weight of the Bush name acted like a heavy mulch, smothering the fire of justice until it was nothing but smoke. As a gardener, I found it harder to look at the mansion after that. The red brick didn't just look like a fortress anymore. It looked like a shroud. I saw the way the family moved, tight-lipped, guarded, their eyes always darting to the gates to see if the world was watching. They were no longer tasting the fantasy. They were choking on it. The weeds of privilege are the hardest to pull. They look like flowers for a long time. They look like fast cars, expensive habits, and the arrogance of untouchability. But beneath the surface, they are parasitic. They drain the life from the host. I began to see the signs of it everywhere. The younger generation was struggling. The drug overdoses, the erratic behavior, the sense of aimless drift. It was as if the American dream had become a nightmare of excess. I remember one morning, I was clearing out a patch of bittersweet vine that had wrapped itself around a young sapling near the mansion's foundation. The vine was beautiful, with bright orange berries, but it was literally strangling the tree to death. I had to use a saw to cut through the thick, woody stems. As I worked, Gussie walked by on the terrace above. He didn't see me. He was looking out over the farm, but he wasn't looking at the animals or the crowds. He was looking at nothing. He had the same vacant stare I had seen in the camels years before. He was a man who had built a kingdom only to find that it was populated by ghosts and lawyers. The rot had reached the top. The public still came, of course. They still drank the free beer and took pictures of the Clydesdales, but the atmosphere had shifted. There was a voyeuristic edge to the tourism now. They weren't just coming to see the success. They were coming to see the tragic bushes. They were looking for the cracks in the marble. I felt a strange grief for the land itself. This was Grant's soil. It was the soil of hardscrabble. It was soil that knew the value of a hard day's work and the bitter taste of honest failure. To see it covered in the rotting fruit of a family that had forgotten how to be human was a heavy thing to bear. I'd spend my evenings in the greenhouse, where things made sense. In the greenhouse, if a plant is sick, you treat it. If it's dead, you remove it. But in the big house, they kept the dead things on life support. They kept the scandals behind the Tiffany glass and the pain behind the champagne. They tried to prune the truth, but the truth is like mint. Once it gets into the garden, you can never truly get rid of it. The 1970s ended not with a celebration, but with a sense of exhaustion. The family was fragmented. Gussie was retreating into the twilight of his life, his loud voice now a rasp of frustration and sorrow. The spectacle was still running, but the actors were tired of their roles. I looked at my roses. They were beautiful, but they were high maintenance. They required constant feeding, constant spraying, constant attention. If I stepped away for even a week, the black spot and the aphids would move in. The Busch dynasty was the same. It was a hothouse flower that had grown too large for its pot, and the roots were starting to circle, strangling themselves in the dark. The gunshot of 1934 had been a sudden tragedy. The rot of the 1970s was a slow one. And as any gardener will tell you, the slow deaths are the hardest to watch. They take away the beauty piece by piece until you're left with nothing but the thorns. In the garden, the most brutal death is not caused by the frost or the drought. It is the stranglehold. It happens when the offspring of a great tree, the suckers and the saplings, grow so close and so aggressively that they begin to steal the nutrients from the parent's root system. They don't wait for the old oak to fall. They hasten the end, crowding the light until the elder begins to wither in the shade of its own creation. In 1975, I witnessed the human version of this biological betrayal. They called it a board meeting, but it was a palace coup. Anheuser Busch Sr, a man who possessed his grandfather's cold discipline but none of his father's warmth, did the unthinkable. He moved against Gussie. He orchestrated a vote that stripped his father of the presidency of Anheuser Busch. It was a clinical, corporate execution, performed in a boardroom downtown, but the blood of it flowed all the way back to the red bricks of Grant's farm. I remember the day Gussie came back to the estate after the retirement was announced. He didn't look like a man who had earned a rest. He looked like an exiled monarch. For the first time in his life, the king of spectacle had no stage. The brewery, which he had run with his heart and his gut for decades, was now the territory of his son, a man who ran it with a calculator and a scalpel. For the next decade, I watched Gussie wander the estate. It was a haunting sight. He would walk past the Clydesdale stables, his hands deep in his pockets, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He'd talk to the camels and the bison as if they were the only subjects he had left who wouldn't betray him. He was a ghost in his own kingdom, a man who had built a world of loudness only to be silenced by his own blood. The big house felt colder then. The parties were fewer, and the laughter that used to shake the Tiffany glass was replaced by the low, strategic murmurs of the next generation. August the 3rd was focused on the bottom line, on the unromantic backbone of efficiency. He didn't care for the spectacle unless it sold a six-pack, but while he was tightening the corporate screws, the rot I saw in the 70s was festering in the youngest of the line, August the 4. If Gussie was the firework and August 3 was the furnace, August 4th was the wildfire. I remember him as a young man on the farm. Charming, yes, but with a restless, frantic energy that the soil here doesn't like. In 1983, the Busch curse struck again. A car crash, a young woman dead. August 4 was behind the wheel. Once again, I saw the mulch of power at work. The lawyers descended. The gates of the farm slammed shut. The story was managed, the consequences were mitigated, and the air was polished up for the next act. But as a gardener, I know that if you don't treat the blight, it just moves deeper into the wood. You can't manage a soul that is breaking. The years began to blur into a long, slow decline. Gussie passed away in 1889, and with him, the soul of Grant's farm seemed to retreat into the hardscrabble dirt. August the 3rd ran the company with an iron fist, turning it into a global titan, but he forgot the lesson of the graft. He forgot that a business is only as strong as its connection to the people who drink the beer. He made it a machine, and machines have no loyalty. Then came 2008, the year the ground finally gave way. The InBev takeover was not just a business transaction, it was a surrender. A Belgian-Brazilian conglomerate, foreign soil, foreign roots, moved in to take the king of beers. I stood in the courtyard of the farm the day the news was finalized. The air felt heavy, stagnant. The American royalty that Adolphus had grafted onto this land with such hunger was being uprooted. August the 4th was the CEO then, the man who had to sign the papers that ended a century of family rule. He looked like a man drowning in his own inheritance. The crown wasn't just heavy, it was a lead weight. When the deal was done, the Busch was removed from the top of the brewery. The Anheuser was just a legacy brand. The empire had been sold for $52 billion, a sum so large it felt meaningless. You can't buy back the pride of a century with any amount of gold. The defeat was absolute. The big house was no longer the headquarters of a dynasty. It was a private residence owned by a family that no longer owned their own name. I saw August 4th during those final days. He looked hollow. The wildfire had burned itself out, leaving nothing but ash and a long list of what-ifs. I walked past the hardscrabble cabin that evening. It looked smaller than ever, but it also looked more honest. Grant had failed here, but he had failed with his hands in the dirt. The Busches had succeeded until they were so far above the dirt that they forgot how to hold on to it. They had built a fortress of red brick to keep the world out, but they had ended up locking themselves into a cage of their own ambition. The crown was gone. The boardrooms were occupied by strangers who cared more about quarterly dividends than the scent of the mash or the majesty of the Clydesdales. The spectacle was now a budget item to be scrutinized by accountants in another country. As a gardener, I felt a strange, mourning peace. The rebound growth was over. The long summer of the Busches had turned into a permanent autumn. I looked at the mansion, the red bricks glowing in the sunset like a dying ember. It was still beautiful, still grand, but it was a shell. The palace coup had been the beginning of the end, and the InBev takeover was the final shovel of earth. The family still lived behind the private walls, but the big house felt like a museum for a history that had stopped moving. The roots were still there, deep in the Missouri clay, but the sap had stopped flowing. The American dream had been realized, expanded, exploited, and finally, sold. I picked up my shears and headed back to the shed. The sun was dipping below the ridge, casting a shadow so long it covered the entire lawn, the courtyard, and the hardscrabble cabin. It was a shadow 100 years in the making. The Busches had arrived with a hunger that reshaped a nation. They left with a fortune that couldn't save their legacy. And as I turned the key in the lock, I knew that the soil, the stubborn, silent witness to it all, was already starting to work on the next layer of the story. Because in the garden, nothing is ever truly gone. It just becomes the fertilizer for whatever comes next. In the garden, there is a cycle that transcends even the most powerful of families. It is the cycle of the long echo. When a great tree falls, its wood eventually turns to mulch, feeding the next generation of weeds and wildflowers. The original purpose of the plant is forgotten, but its presence is still felt in the shape of the mounds and the richness of the soil. Today, Grant's farm and the red brick fortress of the big house have entered their era of mulch. As the gardener who has tended this land for decades, I stand at the periphery of the spectacle and watch the transformation. The mansion, once a closed cathedral of American royalty, has become a backdrop. It is a stage set for hire, a prestigious event space where the echoes of a 100-year dynasty are drowned out by the pop of catering champagne and the frantic rhythm of wedding DJs. There is a strange, almost grotesque irony in the way the present consumes the past without ever bothering to taste it. I watch the young couples arrive. The brides, in their clouds of white silk, glide across the limestone terraces where Gussie once held court and where August Sr. once paced in a gout-ridden fever. They exchange their vows in the grand rooms, promising forever and till death do us part under the same Tiffany glass that watched the family's greatest betrayals and most violent collapses. To them, the red brick is just aesthetic. It is a vibe. They see the European elegance, the hunting trophies, and the heavy oak doors, and they think it lends a sense of permanence to their new unions. They don't know that they are standing on a site of profound human struggle. They don't know that the room, just a few doors down, The master suite is where a man decided that all the wealth in the world wasn't worth the pain of another morning. They smile for the photographer, their backs turned to the shadows, never suspecting that the very air they breathe is heavy with the residue of 100 years of secrets. I find a quiet absurdity in it. To see a bridesmaid laughing near the gunroom, or a flower girl chasing a butterfly across the grass where David Lear's blood once pooled, is to see the human capacity for forgetting. We want our history tidy. We want our monuments to be pretty. We don't want to hear the snap of the revolver or the screech of the 1,983 tires when we're eating a 5-course meal. The tourists still come, too. Thousands of them, lured by the promise of free beer and the sight of the Clydesdales. They walk the paths I have pruned and raked, and they see a fairy tale. They see the king of beers and the American dream. They see a family that made it, and in a way, they are right. The Bushes made it further and higher than almost anyone else in the American story. But as I watch them from the shade of a century-old oak, I know the cost of the ticket. Wealth of this magnitude doesn't just buy you mansions and exotic animals. It buys you a different kind of gravity. It pulls you away from the common earth. It isolates you in a world where the only people you can trust are the ones you pay, and the only people you can fear are the ones who share your last name. I've watched the heirs grow up in this gravity, and I've seen how it warps the bones of the soul. I've seen the softened consequences and the hardened hearts. I am old now, and my hands are as gnarled as the roots of the hardscrabble trees. I am perhaps the only one left who remembers the farm when it was a home, not an asset. I remember the way Trudy's laughter used to cut through the humidity, and the way Gussie's boisterous voice could be heard all the way at the stables. I remember the silence after the 1934 gunshot, a silence that has never truly left the mansion, no matter how much music the wedding bands play. The long shadow I saw forming in the early days now covers the entire estate. It is a shadow cast by ambition that outstripped the human heart's ability to keep up. Adolphus Busch wanted to be a legend, and he succeeded. But legends are cold things. They don't provide much comfort when the lights go out. The final truth of Grant's farm is not found in the brewery's ledgers or the family's bank accounts. It is found in the dirt. It is found in the realization that the American dream, when stretched into a dynasty, often becomes a cage. The same walls that were built to protect the family ended up trapping them. The same privilege that gave them the world also took away their peace. As the sun sets today, the shadows of the mansion's turrets stretch across the lawn like long, dark fingers reaching for the hardscrabble cabin. It is a reminder that failure and success are just two sides of the same coin, buried in the same soil. Ulysses S. Grant failed here and went on to save a nation. The Bushes succeeded here and went on to lose themselves. Who is the winner in that exchange? The land doesn't care. The soil just waits for the next body, the next secret, the next layer of mulch. I put away my tools for the last time today. The party in the courtyard is just getting started. The Bavarian music is playing, and the beer is flowing, and for a moment, the world feels golden and permanent. But I know better. I know that the big house is just a beautiful, red brick echo. Wealth, I have learned, is like the sun. A little bit of it is necessary for life, for the flowers to bloom and the crops to grow. But if you stand too close for too long, it doesn't just warm you, it burns you to a crisp. And if you try to own the sun, if you try to bottle it and keep it for yourself, you'll find that you're left with nothing but a handful of ash and a long, cold night. The Busch family gave America its most famous beer and its most recognizable symbols. They gave us the spectacle and the fantasy. But Grant's farm, in its quietest moments, gives us something more valuable. A reminder that the human heart is a fragile thing, and it cannot be nourished by marble and gold alone. It needs the same thing the roses need: the truth, the light, and the freedom to grow in its own time. The gates will open again tomorrow. The tourists will smile, the couples will wed, and the Clydesdales will parade. And the big house will sit there, silent and grand, holding its breath, waiting for the next echo to fade into the Missouri clay. I leave you with this: do not envy the kings in their fortresses. Envy the man who can walk his own land without being haunted by the roots. Envy the gardener who knows that the most beautiful thing in the world isn't a mansion. It's the simple, honest piece of a garden that has nothing left to hide. The story of the bushes is a story of a dynasty that conquered the world but couldn't conquer the shadow. And the shadow is the only thing that lasts.